Hi, my name's Jeremy, and today we're going to be going through my scrap bin and hopefully making a beautiful end grain cutting board with a set of budget-friendly tools. Going through all these pieces, I'm really not sure why I kept a lot of this stuff. A lot of it's just trash with lots of bark and odd inclusions. So the first thing I had to do was just cut everything down to an equal width so that I could start building my pile of chunks. My Harbor Freight table saw has been pretty good to me, and you'll hear me complain about a few things. And it's not the most precise machine in the world, but I've built some pretty fun stuff with it. The truth is I would love to get a bigger table saw, but I just don't have the space. Alright, so step 2, I need to cut all these pieces of wood down to similar sized chunks. So a lot of these, the ends, have bark inclusions, other faults that I need to cut off. So I generally cut off as little as I can at the end and then start cutting these up into similar sized pieces. One thing that really gets me in trouble on these projects is assuming something. And the thing that I assumed here is that these pieces, which had all been milled previously, some of them years ago, would still be flat on the top and bottom. And that was absolutely incorrect. A lot of these have a crown on them now, and as I'm going to glue these up, I'm realizing that they don't fit together perfectly flat. And it's close enough that I can get some pressure on it with these clamps, and it turns out all right. But there are some gaps on the very tops and bottoms because of the crown of each piece. However, it effectively gets milled out by the flattening jig I'll use here in a few minutes, so it ends up working out all right. However, if I was going to start this all over again, I would definitely run these all through the planer first, just to make sure they had tops and bottoms that were both flat. You can see here under my glued pieces that I'm using a silicone work mat. I've just started using these, and wow, do they make a huge difference. I really don't like taking the time to get out plastic and put it under my workpiece, and so sometimes I fail to do that, and these are really easy just to throw down on the workbench. After having all these sections glued up, I needed to resaw them into smaller subsections, and I just tried to figure out how I could maximize the number of rows and minimize the waste that I had. I could get 2 to 3 equal size subsections out of all these rows, and so that's what I went with. Before I sent these back through the table saw, I needed to make sure that each row had a flat reference side. And I wasn't worried about it getting perfect. I just wanted to make sure it wouldn't rock as it went across the table saw. So here I am with my 12-inch disc sander, just trying to get something semi-smooth to work with. Let's take a second and reflect on what tools I've used so far. I started out with my Harbor Freight table saw, and then I went to this 12-inch Harbor Freight disc sander. I guess there were a couple of Rockler parallel clamps in there, but all in, I am using some pretty cheap tools so far. When it comes time to buy a new tool, I really try to decide if this is something that I'm going to use on a regular basis and I need to spend money on, or if it's something I can get away with buying a cheaper version. After finding a reference edge on all my pieces, it was time to cut all these sections up into smaller subsections. I definitely don't change my blades very often on really any of my tools, but it was pretty obvious here that the saw blade was getting too dull to use effectively. After cutting out all these subsections, I decided to jump online and take a look at the world of circular saw blades. I was pretty shocked. There's an incredible amount of options when it comes to circular saw blades, and I don't know if this is all of these contractor style saws or just this Harbor Freight one, but the blade that it came with is definitely a thin kerf, or at least thinner than the standard kerf. And so when I found the new combination blade that I wanted to buy, I bought a standard kerf blade, which would be great except for it doesn't match the width of the riving knife, and so there's a little play there that I don't want to have. Also, the saw really struggles with a full curved blade, and you'll see me use it here in a little bit, but I really wasn't happy with the lack of power that it made the saw feel like it had. And so I got back online and ordered a thin curved blade, just a general type blade. That way, at least I would have some flexibility moving forward. Earlier, my wife came out to visit me in the garage, and she was asking why my shop is so much dirtier than a lot of the other YouTubers that I watch. And I didn't really know what to say. I can't deny my shop is a disaster, and I try to keep it as clean as I can, but most of the time my ADD just kicks in too hard for me to slow down enough to stop and clean things up in between steps or even in between projects. Plus, I'm constantly trying to maximize my time in between dropping kids off at sports, school, and work. One of my goals for this board was to have diagonal rows. And so in order to achieve that, I used a little spacer block, as you can see here, just to slide the rows so that I can get approximately the same distance. I'm not too worried about getting it perfect because I'm going to end up just cutting a straight line at the end anyways, but this will help me minimize as much waste as possible. One great way to try to reduce some stress in the glue up is to try to not overextend yourself while gluing things together. And I am especially aware of this because I knew that these cuts weren't perfect and there were going to be some gaps that I would need to close up with the clamps. And so because that compounds the more rows that you're trying to glue together, the more gaps that you're trying to close, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to split this up, take it a little easier on myself, and make it less stressful in the long run. These parallel clamps are supposed to provide even pressure on the top and bottom of the piece. However, I have noticed that that is not exactly true. So what I would do to mitigate this and to keep any bending from happening is I put clamps, these F-style clamps, on the top in between the parallel clamps in the bottom. And I find that that evens out the pressure between the pieces that I'm gluing together to give my panels a little bit more straightness in the glue up process. Now I need to address the areas where the clamps were holding these subsections together. So because of the pressure there, I need to flatten out the glue faces. And I don't have a jointer, so I found the best way to do this is to just grab a piece of granite. This one I got at the local home cell resale center, and I put some adhesive sandpaper on and I just go to town. And this, as you can see here, works really well to do any minor flattening. I'm fortunate that my kids love to help with glue ups, and something like this, where it's not super stressful, I love to have them come out to the garage and help. They love to paint with the little silicone brushes, and mostly they love to peel the dried glue out of the paintbrush after it's done. And so I just try to coach them on not squeegeeing off all of the glue, but spreading it around so that there's a nice even layer on the workpiece. And occasionally I have to help them hit a couple of spots. They do really enjoy helping out in the garage. And more than that, I think it really gives them an opportunity to think about what things they can build or what things they can change. It opens up their little brains to think about what sort of projects they might like to do in the future. It's funny because one of the biggest things that I notice in between cheap tools and nice tools is their level of precision. And often you can make do with the cheaper tools independent of whether they last or not. But one of the biggest things that gets you is time. And that's where you have to go back and either make up for a tool not being as precise as it should be, or just start something over again. It was about this moment that I realized that this wasn't quite going together right. I couldn't figure out why these pieces just weren't wanting to go together very well. And so I realized something. I hadn't cut my rows at 90 degrees. My table saw doesn't do a great job of holding its blade over time, and I typically check it pretty often, but I forgot to do it before I started cutting these subsections. And so as I'm clamping these together, I'm realizing, hey, this thing's going together like a potato chip. It's probably a degree to a half a degree off for each section. And so I can see here after it's dried that it is not looking good. So this is something I'm going to have to fix. Working out of the garage, I'm always looking for ways to maximize my space. And one of the biggest tools that I move around often is this lunchbox planer. And I found that by sliding out this into my workbench where I do my mortising, I wish I could say I planned this when I built the workbench, but I just found that it was a great spot to keep this, where it's within reach and out of the way. Now that I have the workbench cleared off, I've thrown up my slab flattening jig so that I can try to correct this potato chipping issue. So here I am just lowering the router down so that it just kisses the highest point of the cutting board. This $99 Ryobi router does this pretty well. I'm not flattening giant tables or anything like that, and so for something small like this, it takes a minute, but it gets the job done. And on my jig here, I just slide the board along the surface of my workbench. If anybody knows why I shouldn't do that, I would love to hear why, but it seems to work pretty well. I think it just references the flat top of my workbench, and I can just slide it along, go back and forth nice and slow. Some of the best advice I've received is try to keep as much material as you can for as long as you can through the process. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First is I mess up. And sometimes if I don't go all the way to my finish depth, I can use that extra thickness to fix whatever mistake I've made. And the other thing is wood movement. I'm not doing this project in one day. And it's not uncommon that I'll do a flattening pass and come back the next day and the piece is no longer flat. And so I want to make sure that after I get down to my final dimensions, as far as the size of the board, I can come back, do another flattening, and have a nice flat board to work with. One other piece of advice here, if you're flattening pieces that you're not going to work on consistently, especially if you're not in a climate controlled space like I am, make sure you store your pieces vertically so they're on their ends. That way the air and the moisture can get to both sides of the pieces. I found that if you lay them flat on your workbench, they can tend to curl up. Back over at the table saw, I'm going to cut my first reference edge for the final shape. And this is really where I'm just trying to start dialing in the final rectangle that the board is going to be. Alright, this gets pretty dicey here. So what happens is the board gets caught on the riving knife because it's not perfectly aligned with the blade. And I actually have to reach forward and just give it a little nudge. So definitely wouldn't recommend doing this. And it doesn't always get stuck like that, but man, it's a little scary when it does. And look at that, when I actually have the blade square, the cut ends up being square too, as I check with my overpriced little triangle. Now that I have one straight edge, what I need to do is cut off at a right angle this triangle so that I can glue it up again on the other side. This will give me my final diagonal and help me to lock in that overall shape that I'm going for. Since I learned about table saw sleds, it really has changed my woodworking for the better. And I really enjoy the freedom it gives me to be able to make more precise cuts than I would have been able to previously. One of the issues I have with this table saw is that miter slot on the left isn't consistent in width. And so the sled will tend to catch or glide depending on where you are on the table. And there it is. I'm starting to stave off my excitement at this point. I'm being cautiously optimistic, but this joint isn't quite what it needs to be. So back over to the granite flattening station where I'll take a few passes off here and make sure it fits up nice and tight. I actually bought this piece of granite in order to flatten the soles of my hand planes. And I thought one day when I was having trouble getting a glue joint to match up just right, that, hey, if this is precise enough for a hand plane, I bet this would work really well for a glue joint. And so I gave it a shot and it worked really well. And I've been doing it ever since. I'm really happy with it. I would love to have a jointer, but I just can't pull the trigger because I don't want to get a small one, and one that's big enough to do what I want to do just wouldn't fit in the garage. So this is where we're at. It works really well. I have been perfecting my hand plane technique, but I have to say it's not very good. Still needs a lot of work. It's just so satisfying to see a couple pieces go together like this and not be able to see where the joint is if it wasn't for the glue squeeze out. And so this was really just a great part of the process, seeing the end in sight and gluing this up. It started sliding around on me a little bit, and I thought, hey, why do this the right way when I can just add more clamps and really try to mess it up? If there is one tool I could go back in time and tell myself to buy earlier, it would be this, the chisel plane. I use this thing all the time. Here I'm using it to scrape off glue, but I use it for just a tremendous amount of things. It is indispensable. All right, here we go with the last passes on the flattening jig. I really want to keep this as thick as I can. I don't have any specific dimension in mind as far as the thickness of the bores go, so I really just want to take as little off as I can. I really like to keep as much meat in that cutting board as I can, and so I'm going to just keep going until I see that last little bit come off of the low spot, and then we're good to go. So I didn't do great on the glue up. I thought, since it fits so well together, that I wouldn't need a ton of pressure. And I knew better than to clamp it like that, clamp it non-perpendicular. But I thought I could get away with it. And it's not great. It's not horrible, but you can definitely see a gap. The gap between that layer is bigger than the rest. So, I think that if I was working on a normal cutting board, I would have just recut that glue joint and then glued it back together. But with this, I can't do that because the amount of wood that the kerf would take out, it would make it really obvious to that particular row that it was a different width. So I think I'm okay. This was going to be the top. It actually looks better on what was going to be the bottom, quite a bit better. So you can see here I've already started to fill some of the gaps that were in the bottom, and I think that will be fine once I take another layer off. And I think we'll be okay. But I'm gonna make it, so I'm just gonna switch to the other side, and then on the underside, this is gonna be kind of a one-sided cutting board because of the way I'm gonna do the feet. But I think we're gonna be okay. Just have to make it work. Here we are back at the table saw, going painfully slow, trying to get this final edge cut. With the new blade, that cuts fantastically well, but the saw just doesn't have the power for it. So here we are at 300% speed, and it still takes forever. After cutting this final side, it's over to my makeshift juice groove station. And in my mind, this worked incredibly well. However, as it often works out, it didn't work as well practically as it did in the head. And so what I thought was I could just create a sort of 90-degree fence here on this workbench, and then do roughly the middle of a side through the corner to roughly a middle of the other side, rotate the board 90 degrees, and then just continue all the way around the board in this fashion. And this works pretty well. The corners look fantastic. The problem is that I can not get the middles to perfectly match up. And I don't know why this is. I don't know if, I mean, I checked the corners. It seems really square, but for whatever reason, there is maybe a few thousandths off where the two middle lines match up. So what I end up having to do is either go back with a half round chisel or sandpaper in the best case, and disguise where those two meet up. Actually, what I did here was I went back with deeper and deeper passes until I could get it where I wanted it to be. And that worked well, and you can't tell. But I think that if I just bit the bullet and actually bought a real jig here for doing this type of thing, it would go a lot easier. I do have to say, of all my Harbor Freight tools, this Bauer trim router is my favorite. I really love this thing. I think it works really well. Now, I don't have any experience with any other trim routers. I do have several other routers, but not trim routers. And it's fantastic. One of the things that I didn't anticipate from doing an in-grade cutting board is how difficult this thing would be to sand. And I mean, it took forever. I really wish I had a more aggressive sander, but I usually start out at 120 grit and go up. Even scaling back to 80 grit, I had to sand this thing absolutely forever. Okay, so the vast majority of tools I use on this project were very inexpensive. However, I do have two very nice tools that I absolutely love to use, and that is this Shaper Origin and a Festool Domino. For this cutting board, I wanted to try to cut the handles out with the Origin. And so I set it up, clamped the cutting board to the end of my workbench, and just on the Origin itself, created a little pocket rectangle. I'm kind of shocked how well this worked, and I definitely will use this again. And I'm kind of excited about trying some more elaborate patterns in the end of the cutting board for a handle. Here you see me trace the same pattern over, taking about 1/4 of an inch deeper each time. The only thing I would do differently next time is the roundover bit left a bit of a pattern that I had to sand off the base layer. And so I would probably switch over to some sort of flat bottom bit just to do that final pass. Everybody's favorite step, putting on finish. This soaked up so much oil, and I know it looks like my fingers are broken here. I was trying to keep my sleeve out of the oil, but I could not believe how much cutting board oil this thing soaked up. It was like pouring it into a sponge. I really wish I had enough of it that I could put it into some sort of basin and just let it soak, because I had to come back and put this on maybe 4 or 5 times before I felt like it had saturated the surface. I really enjoy making cutting boards for gifts, and this one's actually going to my brother, and I'm really excited about how it's turning out. Now, over the years, there's been a few different methods that I've gone through for finishing out these cutting boards, but what I've kind of landed on as the ideal method is I start out just by soaking it with oil as much as I can until I really feel like that process of soaking in the oil has slowed down significantly. And then I let it sit for 24 hours, and the next day I come back and coat it with some food grade cutting board wax. And you really can't skip the wax step. It makes a huge difference as far as it looking good over a long period of time, as well as retaining that kind of water resistance layer that you want from a cutting board. And here we are in my brother's kitchen. I hope he gets lots of years of use out of it for him and his family, and I look forward to the next project. See you next time.